Good morning. Thank you for joining us for this October Roundtable. This month we had 3 articles that address the characteristics of the Lord. We talked about how He is the truth, He is our protector, He's our salvation. And these topics came at a really fitting time for so many people in the Southeast United States. We've had 2 hurricanes that have devastated our communities, and so that's been fresh on our mind. Being in a hurricane always makes me think of the story of when Jesus calmed the storm, and his disciples were fearful and he had been sleeping and they woke him up. And it seems like they'd forgotten all the things that he had just recently done, all the miracles he had performed, all of the healing, and especially like the feeding of the 5,000, which comes directly before this storm. And they cry out to him to be saved. And whether we're in a literal storm like these hurricanes we've just had, or we're just in the storm of life's challenges, Lee, how can we put our faith in the Lord as our protector and keep ourselves from being like the disciples on the boat who have forgotten what Jesus has done for us?
Lee, was this question you were going to take?
Yes, I'm so sorry. I didn't hear the end of, I think, what Shelby said, possibly. So sorry about that, Shelby.
No problem.
Technology's great when it works. So I thought Jeannie Culp did a great job dealing with this question, this idea of why should we be so afraid? And like you said, it seems silly for them to have been afraid. They've witnessed his power. They've witnessed, they know who Jesus is. They've seen him heal. They've seen him speak words and not even touch the people. The centurion says, no, 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 there's no need for you to come. Just speak it. They've seen all these things. And even in the midst of all that, the fear comes out. This question pops out. And the question of, what are you gonna allow us to perish in this situation? And when Jesus rebukes them, it's almost as if he says, you followed me onto the boat. You know who I am. You know what I'm teaching. Do you think I'm gonna drown in a storm? Do you think that I can heal from miles away, but I can't deal with this situation? I couldn't save us from this. And I think we look at it and we think, well, that's so silly. Except for we act the same way. We forget who God is. We forget what He is capable of. And maybe there are real things to be afraid of. And I started thinking, I if you talk to my students, they're afraid of everything from clowns to failure. And I think failure is a fear for us. What if I put myself out here? What if I try this and it doesn't work? What if I want to talk to this person and they won't listen to me about the gospel? We are afraid of being found out sometimes. It would be a scary thing for me, for people to see some of the darker parts of my heart. Sometimes it's scary for me to confront myself. That's a scary thing. More than 300 times in the scriptures, we are told not to be afraid. Don't be afraid. You look at people who are in war zones or in prisons or in battles, or even just at a dinner table. Don't be afraid to associate with these people. Don't be afraid that face to face with God or his messengers. Don't be afraid. Fear not. We're told over and over. It's a message that runs through the scriptures. But Satan is so good at his job that he undermines that confidence that we have in God and in our faith, just like he did with Eve. He still whispers things in our ears and says, well, that's not really right. Here's a twist on that. The best lies start with a piece of truth, right? And so what happens is we're just surrounded with these messages, I really think, that are designed to undermine the confidence that we have in our faith. We're told, instead of trusting God, to trust our government or to trust people or some other institutions, which invariably always let us down. We're bombarded with information about wars and disasters and oppressions and illnesses. We see images that are horrific that we can't unsee. In the 21st century, fear is almost a culture of its own. It is, there are historians now that believe that part of our historical context, 200, 150, 200 years from now, when people look back, that what they're going to see is that we have a culture of fear, that it underlies our politics, it underlies our economies, it underlies our voting habits, it underlies even just our personal relationships, that fear is something that is fed on. And I think the fact that it has 300, that God says 300 times in the scriptures not to be afraid, that it's always been that way. Because fear is also associated with adrenaline. So I started going down that rabbit hole, that we have this fear response that God gave us to help us in danger, and that it's not unhealthy, but it can be addictive. You know, you think about people who are entertained by scary things. I am not one of them. I can't take anything that's too intense or scary. I don't like movies where I'm going to be scared. But think about scary movies or people who become adrenaline junkies. That idea, even games that we play with children have this low level of surprise where they don't know what's going to happen. And that ups the adrenaline and the excitement so that when you do jump out at them, you get the scream and the running away. And in small doses, fear can be appealing. In fact, in some ways, it's entertaining. And it's not in those small doses that it's dangerous, but living in constant fear actually is physically damaging. That adrenaline that's produced in small doses, when we're really afraid and our fight or flight responses and all of those things kick in, it spikes and then it decreases rapidly, which is why we often see people kind of crash after those events. But in small doses, even if it's consistent and it's over time and it never goes away, it actually produces some of the same results as a trauma. It's damaging to us, not only to our physical. We've all had situations, we talk about mind over matter, right? That idea where we've felt so afraid of something or guilty over something where we've made ourselves sick. There's a physical manifestation of it. But that constant level of adrenaline can lead to memory gaps and mood swings, a lack of ambition, this kind of paralysis of being able to make a plan and carry it through and move forward and progress. It can lead to paranoia. The list is extensive of the damage that it can do to our bodies and our minds and our productivity and our relationships. And so for a Christian, giving in to fear and anxiety is a spiritual death sentence, which is why Satan uses it, because it distracts us. You know, Shelby, you talked about both of the men who come to Jesus and ask the question, what can I do to inherit eternal life? And the one that we're told about just prior to the parable of the Good Samaritan, he comes in and of course he's rich and he's confident and he associates with the right people. He's arrogant. He's trying to trap Jesus. But what Jesus tells both of them really is that the answer to how to inherit eternal life is love. Love is the thing that's going to make the difference. We have to love God, and then we have to love our neighbor. You know, fear shouldn't have the last word with us. It's not the final sentence, because love is. If we look at the end, the worst thing that could happen to us here is not the last thing that's going to happen. If we look at the end, we see the end. We already know how this ends. In Revelations 21 and 22, we get a glimpse into heaven. And what we see in heaven is that there is no fear, and there is no pain, and there is no suffering. There's no tears. None of those things exist anymore. At the end, what we're told in 1 Corinthians 13 is that there's going to be faith and hope and love. Those are the things that are going to remain. This is how it ends. And so to me, the opposite of fear isn't fearlessness. That would be recklessness. And if you've ever had a child who's a little bit reckless, I was reckless as a child and got myself into all sorts of dangerous situations. It's not that. The opposite of fear isn't fearlessness. The opposite of anxiety and stress isn't indifference. It's not that we don't care about anything. The opposite of both is hope. And it's hope that's based on our faith, and then that manifests itself and is acted on through love. That's what remains. And so things that happen in this life aren't gonna, this is just a season. They're only going to be a season. And so I have to let go of my fear and anxiety, at least to the point that it distracts me from work in the kingdom. I think about the verses in the Sermon on the Mount, and those are a common place for us to go when we talk about fear and anxiety, those about not being afraid of what the future holds. They're really a continuation of the verses before, in verses 19 through 21 of Matthew 6, where he talks about laying up treasures in heaven and not on this earth, that we have to be focused on what comes next, on the things that are going to last, and not on the earth. And then he talks about the darkness and the light within, and then he talks about you can't serve two masters. And then in verse 25, he says, therefore, be anxious for nothing. If you've got your priorities in line and you're laying up your treasures in heaven, then you don't have to be anxious about this life. And so I guess, you know, then the practical part of that is, what does that look like in our lives? And how do we do that? The easy answer is get to work. Turn off the television and stop scrolling. And get rid of the messages. So when I was a young woman, we didn't have all of those things, but we already had that 24/7 news cycle. And I think back to that right around the time John had just been born was the Y2K scare, right? And so that all the computers and everything was going to shut down as soon as it was January 1st, the year 2000. So get your money out of the bank. I mean, there were runs on banks. People thought we're not going to be able to get our money because the computers ran everything already, more or less. And so it was all going to shut down. And it was, I had a little bitty who I felt, not felt responsible for, I was responsible for. And so, those ideas of, or the local news saying, are your children safe? News at story at 11. And I just thought, if he's not safe, tell me now. I'd like to know this very minute. And so I got into a little bit of a spin myself. And I decided I just had to stop watching the news because it was everywhere. You couldn't get away from it. And that idea of fear, one of the first things experts will tell you is stop watching the news. Stop. If we look back to before even televisions, if there was a tidal wave in Asia, you may not know about it for 4 months. If you're living on the East Coast in America, if there was a war in the Middle East, you might not know about it for 6 months. You might never know about it because it doesn't have any impact on your immediate existence. But now we can see disasters from 14 different angles because everybody has a camera in their pocket and we know about it immediately. And then it triggers all of those responses, those fears. Satan's really good at what he does. And then we become distracted because we're worried about things that may be sad. Maybe we need to pray for the people there, but by the way, over which we have no control and usually can't help with. And so we have to stop. That was my trigger. And so I stopped. I probably haven't seen a full news broadcast in, 25 years. Because that was the thing that distracted me. And so you have to get yourself out of that cycle. And maybe there are people who really are so anxiety ridden that they need professional help, or maybe you need to talk to another Christian sister, somebody maybe older, maybe a little more with more perspective, but you can study and you can pray. You could get a hobby. I mean, anything that's going to get you out of that. Make a list. I see people making lists of things that they're grateful for every day. But we have to learn how to banish fear. And the only way we do it is by building our faith so that we know our hope. And so that then love prompts us to serve.
Yeah. I think you're exactly right. And it's funny that those news cycles really do create lots and lots of fear. And I think, like you said, in order to get rid of that fear, we have to put our faith and our hope in Jesus and God and in their control. And being able to put our trust in our faith requires belief in them being valid and their validity. And we see in the Sermon on the Mount that Jesus starts to come in and he preaches, and we're told that he preaches with authority, unlike the scribes and the teachers that had come before him. And for us, it's obvious to see where his authority comes from because we know that he is truth. And in this month's article, our guest author, Madeline, referenced Jesus's words in John 14:6, where he says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. And in his conversation with Pilate, Jesus says that anyone that is of the truth listens to his voice. So, Amy, what do you think it means to be of the truth? How do we let that belonging to truth set us apart from the world?
Yeah, thanks, Shelby. Lee had mentioned this before, but I had written an article on the truth, the belt of truth, back in 2022 when we did the armor of God, and that was a really good process for me to walk through, really thinking through what is truth, especially that belt of truth. We refer to Christ as the truth, and that is absolutely true, obviously, but it's a bigger piece to that. And I think so much of it has to do with who Christ is. And he is reality. He is the proper reality. And we live in a culture that has become very relativistic, right? We build our own realities. We have even something called virtual reality, right? I mean, we have all of these things where we've created realities, but we are not necessarily rooted in the reality. And recently, we've been going through a study on Wednesday nights through Colossians, and it really got me thinking about this fact, like resting in Jesus. And so, at the beginning of Colossians, I'm going to just read out of it. In chapter 1, it's probably a passage many are familiar with, and it says, "So as to walk in a manner worthy of the Lord, fully pleasing to Him, bearing fruit in every good work, and increasing in the knowledge of God. May you be strengthened with all the power according to His glorious might." For all endurance and patience with joy, giving thanks to the Father who has qualified you to share in the inheritance of the saints in light. The reason why I pull that out is the more I read through that, I thought, this is reminiscent of Jesus saying, I am the vine, and you are the branches, right? So he is the life-giving source. That's who he is. And you can't do those things without being attached to the vine. You can't bear good works, right? Not the good works he's talking about. You can't grow in strength and glory, right? If I go chop off a branch and just let it lay there, there's no growth that happens. In fact, it just dies. That's what happens. But if that branch stays attached to the source, right? The main trunk, that's where the growth comes from, right? All of that is coming from this main source. And so what I'm getting at is we're not attached to the truth. Guess what? We are going to drift farther and farther away from reality, the true reality. We're going to lose sight of that. We'll have no access to that strength that's given. And I think belonging to the truth means it's this strange paradox, because it is living in the reality of what body am I given, right? What are my physical realities that I'm in? It is all agreeing with that. But then there is this piece to faith that we don't understand, right? I can't see God. I can't see the spiritual realm. I don't understand that. And so we have to somehow mentally connect into that. We talk a lot about faith, like how we do that. I think the scary part is the more we try to construct it in our reality instead of grounding it in what God has revealed about himself through the Bible and scriptures, that's where the danger comes in. What I find in myself typically, in fact, I'd said that, this prayer that Paul says, like, I pray that you be strengthened. right? From God. And our preacher had asked like, well, what does that mean exactly? And what I have found is the more I try to do that in my own strength, right? Like I'll say, I'm gonna get myself together, right? I'm gonna get it all going. And the more I try, it seems like the harder I fall, right? It's just I make a disaster of it and it's a mess. But the more I can get myself out of the way and truly try to just connect with the vine, like if I can connect into that and say, Lord, help me, just make me move out of the way, and you create in me the right reality. That's when I typically can do better. But I think this connects back with Lee's question, because what happens then is we can we'll get in a rhythm of that, and then something will pop up, right? Our storm on the sea will pop up, and all of a sudden, I mean, you think about it, those disciples were in a boat with Jesus. They were physically able to see him, like in the same space, but they forgot. They just forgot. And the thing is, I tend to do the same thing. I'll just have gotten out of a prayer. And then, one of my favorite scenes in literature, because it's me. I look every time. In Anna Karenina, there is this a character called Levin, and he goes through this spiritual awakening, and he's praying, and he is going to be a good husband. Oh, he's going to be so good, and whatever. And he's walking back after this prayer, okay? And his wife says something and gets annoyed, and he's just frustrated, and he's like, "Well, okay, I already blew it." I mean, but this is how we work, right? We work in this method where we're getting in a good rhythm, but it's because then we lose connection, right? We lose connection with the truth and with reality. And all I can say is you have to constantly, like, this is a habitual routine that you have to get yourself in the mindset of. Um, and it doesn't have to be as big as a storm or a natural disaster. It can be something tiny that sets you off course on that, right? Your child can say one thing to you, and all of a sudden you're losing it. For mothers, or honestly, your spouse, right? I mean, quite frankly, that is very. Or you could be a young person and your sibling can do this to you, right? And you are now losing it. But I think the point is sometimes it's recollecting yourself or giving yourself a minute, and you've got to attach back into the truth, right? That's your job, is just to be back into that and move yourself out of the way. And I think this is going to play, I know, Shelby, into your later questions, because I think so often we think somehow we're gonna earn this ourselves. We're gonna buckle down and we're gonna get this, but we have to move ourselves out of the way, right, to be with the truth. And there should be some peace and rest, right? So if we go back to Jesus's words that say, my yoke is easy, right? My burden is light. We are a slave to something, period. The end, stop, right? You will be a slave. You will serve something. But who is your master? And if your master is Satan, I'm going to just tell you right now, his yoke is not easy and his burden is not light. Okay. It is going to be a very difficult life. But Jesus promises something different, and it's psychological peace. That's what like, there is something that is so calming about that. And when you ask the question, how do we let that set us apart from the world? That's it. That is it. Especially today, if you look around, it is not people at peace. These are not peaceful times. They are not peaceful people. They are trying to create their own realities, and these realities aren't particularly nice. And so I think what's going to set us apart is relying on our Lord and not on ourselves, and taking that peace in, not being defined by the fear of our generation, but rather being defined by our Lord of peace.
Absolutely. I like the way you say that we're, rooted in reality. I think about the disciples on the boat and, being thrown about and rocking back and forth, and feeling like you're going to go over the edge, or the water's going to start to come in. And that's kind of, a good imagery for what it's like to not be rooted in reality. You're constantly being tossed about to and fro with every new idea, new trend, whatever it might be, and it leaves us with such a lack of consistency. And so how could we be faithful people filled with hope, and not crippled with our fears when we don't have any sort of consistency or confidence in our faith and what the Lord has for us. And we, like I said, confidence in God's protection and in his truth is something that seems easier for me to have confidence in than having confidence in my salvation. I think since I know I'm undeserving, since I know that I am constantly falling short, I'm so intimately aware with how short I fall, that it's really hard for me to feel like, yes, I am confident that I am going to be with the Lord one day. And so I hesitate in that confidence. And I think that can be a challenge for us because we know that God's promises are true and we know that he is faithful. And so, Lee, how can we have confidence in our salvation when we know that it's not something that's earned or something that we can do to, complete all the check boxes and say, okay, I've met the requirements?
Well, I think that's a great question. And I actually think this is a really hard thing to process, maybe not to understand. Like we can understand it. We understand that but I actually think that processing the fact that we're not good is the first step. In that idea, Ephesians 2:8-9 says that we're saved by grace through faith, that it's not of ourselves, but that it's God's gift. It's God's gift. It's not by works, so that nobody can boast. So he takes pride out of that, out of our service to begin with. And so understanding that Jesus had to pay the penalty in order for me to have any hope, because I am flawed and insufficient. And so if I'm willing to accept that gift, we talked about the apostles followed him into the boat. We do the same thing. We have to follow, and then we have to believe that he is who he said he was and says he is, and that I'm going to accept that as a truth, and I'm going to look at all of the promises that have been fulfilled, that I know that God can't lie, and I know that he's immutable, and I know those things are sure, and that's the rock then that I'm going to build my life on. And that's, like Amy said, it's not going to be easy. And like you said, we're not always going to feel confident. But I actually think that one of the trickiest things is that idea of what it means to be good. Jesus, he even says that the only one who's good is God. If you asked people, a cross section of people in and out of the church, what you have to do, if you ask people in the church what you have to do after you're baptized to be saved, or if you ask people out in the world what you have to do, they would say you live a good life, you're kind, and maybe go to church. Hits the list, right? That idea, you might use many different words, but the idea is that somehow we earn it. That we're gonna do what the Pharisees did. We're gonna turn this into a system of checks and sometimes even balances, where we're going to somehow earn our salvation or deserve it because we've been good. Heaven is where good people go, and hell is where bad people go. And what's interesting for most people, if you do any kind of studies with a lot of different kinds of people, what's interesting is that for most people, their definition of good includes themselves. They define good in such a way that it also envelops them. And I think by nature we're all just a little bit self-righteous. And what coming to Christ does for us is it sucks that out of us. And other than true Christians, people who understand who they are, most people don't consider themselves to be bad or even lacking. The norm seems to view oneself as good, or at least mainly good. And I'm not dealing drugs or selling my body on the street, and so mostly I'm good. And the scriptures just teach completely against that we're never going to be good enough to deserve heaven. And so in God's eyes, everyone who sins is a sinner, And as such, we're unworthy to be in his presence. And so we have to start there, that somehow this is going to be some system of scales where all of our good deeds are going to be put in a scale and our bad deeds are going to be put on the other. And we just hope that they counterbalance each other. Good people deserve to go to heaven. And so it's really ironic then at the end of the day that heaven's going to be populated by people who know that they're bad, because that's who we are when we're confronted with the one who is truly good, the only one who's good. I'm not a good person. Even the best things that I do can be rejected by God if my motivation is wrong, or if they're not done out of love. Isaiah 64 verse 6 says that even in our righteousness, our deeds can be like filthy garments. And so, when the other young man who asked the question that you dealt with in your article, when the rich young ruler calls Jesus good, Jesus says, well, there's only one that's good, and that's God. And that had to be a provocative question to the rich young ruler, because he obviously saw himself as good. When Jesus said, keep the law, he says, well, I've done that. Super. Check. I'm done. He thought he was good because he did the things. And so if my goodness is the only way that I'm going to get into heaven, then I am doomed. I'm dead in the water before I ever start. In Romans 5, verses 6 through 10, I'm just going to read them. For when we were still without strength, in due time Christ died for the ungodly. For scarcely for a righteous man will one die, yet perhaps for a good man someone would even dare to die. But God demonstrates his own love towards us in that while we were sinners, Christ died for us. Much more then, having been justified by his blood, we should be saved from the wrath through him. For if when we were enemies, we were reconciled to God through the death of his son, much more, having been reconciled, we shall be saved by his life. So your question, how do I know? How am I confident? Well, I'm confident because I'm told that if I'm covered by the blood of Jesus, if I've been joined with him in his death through baptism, and if I have truly been risen to walk in a newness of life, and I've allowed myself to be transformed, then I can plant my flag there. I can build myself on those promises that as insufficient and as imperfect and as undeserving as I am, I can be found righteous through his righteousness. Like Amy was saying, the first year we did this, we dealt with the armor of God and the breastplate of righteousness that it covers the most important portions of our vital organs. It's not my righteousness, but he's provided me with his truth, his righteousness, his spirit, his helmet of salvation, all of the things that are given to me to stand firm are provided. I just have to pick them up and put them on. Grace is that undeserved favor, and mercy is actually not getting what we deserve. And so in neither, I don't deserve either. And if we think that we can merit salvation, then we've missed the whole point. The whole point is that we can't. And that God has promised salvation to those who come to him. We get to choose to be chosen. We have to come brokenhearted. We have to come thirsting and hungering after righteousness. And we have to come realizing that we are spiritually bankrupt. And then we will continue to reflect on ourselves. What Christianity, what coming to Christ forces us to do is the thing that I said is really scary to do. It makes us face ourselves. I have to know who I am. I have to know the darkest parts of my heart. And I think David, even when he prays, search my heart, he's saying, I don't even know always the darkest parts of my own heart. Break me apart, tear me apart, shine your light in those dark corners, and then put me back together and make me grateful for the pain of it. We can come to God just saying the things and not wanting them. You know, teach me patience. We pray, teach me patience. But we don't want to be taught patience by any situation that's going to require us to really be patient. I have that problem, you know, and I think sometimes those problems come out of the fact that we self-reflect and nobody else does. You know, it's really hard to be in a relationship. A lot of us, we have all sorts of relationships with people who are just good people, who have that idea of goodness within and of themselves, whatever that means to them. And that changes based on cultural messages and society. They never reflect on themselves. If we're in complicated relationships, you know, I've made no secret about the fact that my marriage is complicated. And I am constantly thinking that wasn't kind, and try, you know, and thinking about the way that I have to behave. The other person's not. And so that complicates those relationships for us, this idea of goodness being good enough. If I want to be firm in my hope, then I have to be firm in my faith. And those things will cause me to be firm in my love. And it won't just be about the action, some checklist. I can't just be happy that the words in my head didn't come out of my mouth. I have to think about why they were in my head to begin with. And that goes back to my heart. And so we are constantly confronting who we are. We're holding our mirror up, like James says. We can't look in the mirror and walk away and forget what we look like. And so my confidence is that God is who he says he is and will do the things that he said he's going to do. My lack of confidence is not him. My lack of confidence is me. But then I have to have the confidence that he covers me. We talked about that breastplate of righteousness that we don't think we take it off and put it back on and it comes off and it slips. And I believe that if I am in a relationship with God and he knows my heart and he knows my intentions, then his righteousness and grace covers me. I don't think if I sin once and die that I'm outside of his righteousness. I believe he has the power and the love and the mercy to make me sufficient in my insufficiencies.
It kind of ties into what I talked about in my article this month, just about, you know, obedience coming before the love in it, and that we do pretty well with knowing, okay, well, I have to do this and I have to do this and I'll follow this. And whether it's that we don't understand why we're doing it or we don't truly appreciate the benefits that our obedience brings us, that obedience in service can lead us to that self-righteous human nature of feeling like I've done something to deserve the salvation that I'm going to receive because of my obedience, because of my my faith in God's promises. And I think it's really a large challenge. I know for me, when I do things and when I'm out serving the Lord and his people, to take a step back and say, this is not for me. This is not for my own self-righteousness. This is not for my own pride, but this is me giving back the love to God that he has given me every day of my life. And, you know, it cannot be earned. We know that it is a gift, like you mentioned earlier, Lee. But we are told to live a life of service. And I think sometimes it's hard to remove ourselves from that idea that labor equals wage. You know, we work in a society where the more hours we work, the more money we make. And so I think sometimes it's hard to pull our service of the Lord out of that idea of work in the world. And so we we're supposed to serve our neighbors out of love to them, and not out of what we're going to get in return. So Amy, how do you feel like we can keep from feeling like we're entitled to our salvation because of our service?
Yeah, this is probably, if I'm very transparent, this is probably one of the hardest things I have to continually remind myself of. I tend to probably be more of a, I want to consider myself fair or justice, oriented. And so then you think, well, it's kind of that older brother mentality, right? I've been here all along, and why are you treating me like that? Or why does my younger brother get all of these things? To me, it's very reminiscent of the parable that Jesus gives in Matthew 20. And I'm going to come back to that. But one of the questions, and this is going to sound like it's going off topic, but a lot of times people will say, why did Jesus teach in parables? And I actually am very, very passionate about that. Humans tend to relate to stories. There's something in them that we hear a story, and it's almost easier for us to understand truth from the story than from if you're just straight out told. And I get this from scripture, right? Nathan comes to David with a story and he says, let me tell you the story about this man, and he has this sweet sheep. And boy, David is fired up. He is fired up. If Nathan would have walked in and said, you have done sinfully, David, there immediately would have been a barrier put up within David. And like, he's going to try to self-justify. He's going to try all of the tactics humans try. But a story helped break some of that down so that he could see himself in the story. And that's why we teach children, right? I mean, we teach children through stories. We use stories to help pass along virtue and vice. If you want to summarize Frog and Toad, right, you're going to be talking about a lot of vice, right? I mean, that's what Toad is. And quite frankly, as an adult, I laugh. I see myself in Toad, like, I've got to stop eating this food, but I'm not. I'm just going to keep eating, right? I mean, so that's the point of stories. It's to be a mirror, like what Lee was talking about, this mirror. So if we go look at one of these stories that Jesus talked about in Matthew 20, he's talking about all these laborers in the vineyard. I'm going to summarize. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but he hires people out first thing in the morning. They agree to a wage. Then he realizes he needs more people out working in his vineyard. So he keeps hiring all through the day, all to the point where at the end of the day, he's hired folks in for 1 hour. And if I remember correctly, he even just says, just come work. I don't think they have this discussion about what they're going to get paid or not. Like, and they agree. They said, yeah, we'll come work. Well, he starts, and again, this isn't coincidence, right? I think Jesus teaches this parable in a certain way. He starts with the people that worked last, and he gives them this full wage. And boy, I can just even picture the whole scene in my mind, right? You can watch the people seething at the end, right? That have worked all day, right? And he gets to them and they are angry. They're like, wait, I'm sure expecting, oh, he's going to up our salary, right? Like, we're going to get more. This is how it's going to play out. But no, that's not how it played out. And he even said, didn't you agree to this? Isn't this what you agreed to? Like, so he's even pointing out this wasn't unjust, right? What I did was not unjust because you agreed to this. But it's also this mirror to us to make it seem like, oh, you think that you're so good, right? Like that somehow you have brought something to the table that is so special or so amazing that it's a ticket in. And to me, how we stop ourselves from believing is this constant, it's what Lee talked about. It's a constant mirror. And I think whether that's through parables or stories, whether that's through looking at Jesus's life himself and saying, where do you measure up to that? Right? I mean, are you even remotely close? Of course, none of us are. And then I think at the end of the day, how you marry that back to the confidence is when I look at heaven and hell, I know so many of us, even as children, right? You start off with like, oh, if I'm just good enough, I'll get to heaven. And if I'm bad, I'm gonna even there was a fear base to my salvation, quite frankly, right? My decision. I mean, I just didn't want to go there. Like I was scared. And but at the end of the day, as you mature and grow, you realize both of these places are about the relationship you want to maintain, like that you have been building your whole life and you'd like to maintain for eternity. And so, do you want to be near your Savior? Do you want to be near the Lord? Is that who you want your master to be? Well, then heaven is a natural progression for that, right? You are linked with him and you're asking for his grace to just get in the door. That's who you are. if you don't desire that, really God's just going to grant you your wish of what you wanted your relationship to be all along. He's granting that. He's saying, okay, I've let you choose. There you go, right? You get what you want. And so the thing is, in both of those cases, you get what you want. Like that's what it's about. And God is saying, if you want heaven, I will give it to you, right? I will give it to you. But that doesn't mean you just get to go, I'm going to just go live any life I want. No, that means we live in relationship, right? You want a true relationship with me. And the closest thing I can think to this is, as a mother, I would say there are a lot of things that we end up doing. And I mean, I guess you could, right? You could start to tally it all up and think, boy, I could charge you this much, right? Like for all the work I've done for you, right? But you don't feel that way, right? And that's what think I'm trying to get at is that we can start to think of our service in this way, or we can start to view our service just like with our kids. We're doing it because we love them and because we're in relationship with them. And it's just part of that. It flows out of that need versus this, I'm kind of in this embittered spot and I'm just doing it because I have to. And, I mean, so we can make out of this what we want, but every little thing, Liz isn't on this call, but she used to always make jokes all the time, right? About how, you'd feel compelled to do something. And she's like, well, you've lost your gold star, right? Like you don't get credit for that one today because of your attitude. And the fact of the matter, I mean, we'd laugh about it, but the fact of the matter is there are so many times I've done things, again, you could title them as good, but they weren't really good. They weren't because I didn't have the proper attitude at all. And typically when I have done something that is what I would say that leans more toward the side of good, the only reason why is because I've moved myself out of the way, like we talked again, and I'm allowing Christ to work in me. And so it's really Christ that is good in me. Like Christ has filled me with that capability. And so again, you can't view it as your own. It's not your own, right? When it is my own, it's usually corrupt and messed up and just a wreck. And if it has some level of goodness, it's only Christ that's showing that. And I think we have to just constantly remind ourselves that's what it is. Because the very question answers it. How do we stop ourselves from believing our service? Well, guess what? Anything that is ours is corrupt. And so what we have to say is it's not my service, it's Christ's service through me. Like, let me act as a vessel for him. And I think that's how we can get better at that. Again, this is a journey. We're all on this journey and we're working to get better and better at that. But, and it's this balance, it's a balance between maintaining your confidence, but it's because of your relationship with Christ.
Absolutely. And Amy, I think you hit on something really interesting that I have seen a lot of lately and just has been really heavy on my heart is this idea that our service is not our service, but it's Christ serving through us. And I think something that I have struggled with for the last few years is being really picky and choosy about how I'm going to serve. And I am serving, but I don't want to do that because that's really inconvenient to me, or it's not a good time, or that's not the most glamorous of ways that I can serve. And so I become picky and choosy. And like I mentioned earlier, we have been inundated with these hurricanes over the last 6 weeks. And I have learned so much and seen so many beautiful examples of Christ serving through us and through his people. And so I just want to leave us with an admonition this week as we think about the things that we've talked about this morning about being rooted in reality and really letting Christ's love show through us rather than being self-righteous and inundated with what we want and how we're going to look. And so, I've been surrounded by some destruction, some death, some uncertainty through these hurricanes and the damages that they've done in my community. And I have been so encouraged. I've witnessed so much deep sacrificial love of God's people. I've seen people taking off time of work and losing wages so that they can do hard manual labor. I've watched people wade through contaminated water to clean out houses that have been flooded. I've seen women coordinate meals and childcare and furniture and other earthly needs for those that they worship with. And I just encourage everybody listening to look for those opportunities in your congregation, in your communities, not because it'll check a box, not because it's glamorous and it looks good, but because Christ is showing you that there is a way that he needs you to serve for him. And because of his sacrificial love, we have salvation. And because of his loving kindness, we have the opportunity to spend eternity with him. And it is the least we can do to pass along that loving kindness and that sacrificial love. And so I hope you were able to take something away from our conversation this morning. I hope you're excited for November's articles and more insightful conversations with God that will be highlighted. So thank you for joining us, and I look forward to more great conversations in the future.